Perfect. So I should be recording. So I will introduce myself again for those who haven't heard, haven't met me yet. You're not part of the Educators Network, for example. My name is Bridget. I work for Duolingo for Schools. I run our Educators Network, which I'm going to be talking about today. It is our private Facebook group with teachers from all over the world who utilize Duolingo in their classroom and share tips and tricks and resources that they've created as well. So if you're not part of our Educators Network, please join us. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that later on today as well. I just mentioned I taught French for 5 years in upstate New York before I moved to the south of France just last year. I also taught Spanish, Italian as well for those years where we couldn't find language teachers, which I'm sure a lot of you know that sentiment. I do have an icebreaker question. So for everyone in the chats, please type in the chats. Let me know if you have any fun language learning mishaps, language learning mistakes that you'd like to share. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about making mistakes today. So I thought this could be a fun little icebreaker to get to know one another. So please feel free to write that in the chat. I can share one that happened recently to me just a few months ago since I've been living in France. I accidentally told a woman in the street who had a really cute little dog, and my dog was meeting her dog. And she made a joke about how another dog at the end of the street was afraid of her little adorable dog. And in French, I wanted to sarcastically say like, oh yeah, he's so scary. And I accidentally used the word frightening, but in a monstrously ugly way. I said, il est affreux, as opposed to il est effrayant. So I told this woman that her dog, who was adorable, was actually monstrously ugly. So I didn't realize my mistake until it was too late. And it was certainly funny, and I will never make that mistake again. So let me know if you have any fun language learning mistakes in the chat. I would love to hear any of them. Yeah, Pamela in the chat shouting out the Duolingo Educators Network. Yes, please join us there. But if you need some time to type out your language learning mistake, that's totally fine too. I would love to see it later on as well. So a little bit too, Madam, since I just was talking about the Duolingo Educators Network in the chat, that's another great way to keep up with what kind of events we have going on. For example, last week, we actually had what we call our speaker series event, where we had Gabriel Silva, who is a polyglot with 300,000 followers on his YouTube, where he is posting all about his language learning journey, as well as a language teacher himself. And so he talked a little bit last week about the affective filter and student motivation. So I'm actually going to share that video. It's up on YouTube if you're interested in taking a look from last week. So I'm going to share that in the chat. But we're kind of building upon that momentum today and talking about lowering the affective filter with Duolingo. So it is just me up here. I'm going to do my best to pause every once in a while, take a look at the chats, answer any questions. If for whatever reason I don't get to your question, I'll make sure to reach out to you, whether by email or at the end of the session. If you're still around, I'll make sure to try to get to your question. And I do want to mention too, I mentioned a little later on, you're going to have the ability I'll stop recording, you'll have the ability to turn on your microphone and your camera if you would like to get to know one another. But we're also going to talk about an opportunity on how you get swag, Duolingo swag for your classroom. So stick around to know a little bit more about that. So let's just jump in though. So let's talk a little bit. I've been talking about the affective filter. So what is the affective filter exactly? Well, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines affective as referring to, arising from, or influencing feelings or emotions. The affective filter specifically is a proposed hypothesis from Stephen Krashen, who is an expert in the field of linguistics, who proposes that there are a number of affective variables that contribute to second language acquisition. The three variables that he proposes are motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety. So in essence, what this means is when feelings or most emotions such as anxiety, fear, or embarrassment are elevated or high, it becomes difficult for language learning to occur. The affective filter has commonly been described as an imaginary wall in the minds of our students that prevents input, which of course is going to block cognition. It's going to block learning for them. In opposition, when the affective filter is lowered, the feeling of safety and security is high, and therefore learning can occur for our students. There are some factors in a classroom that raise the affective filter, thus blocking out cognition in student learning. For example, error correction, making mistakes, being embarrassed about these mistakes. Isolation, we all know this from the pandemic and how that's affected our students' ability to learn and use the target language, for example. Embarrassment, anxiety, or lack of comprehensible input, the lack of them hearing that target language in the classroom. So let's look at these three variables: motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety, how exactly they contribute to second language acquisition, and how we can lower the affective filter for our students. So specifically with motivation, of course, we as teachers don't have the ability to simply wave a magic wand to increase our students' interest and motivation. There are, however, ways we can influence their motivation. So choice and relevance are two examples of factors that increase student motivation. And this is actually something that Gabriel spoke to about just last week. So please check out that video if you're interested to know a little bit more, but from a polyglot's point of view about learning language and motivation. Allowing the students to choose their output and or their input of language learning goes a long way to increase student motivation. For example, on Duolingo, you could assign student 50 XP a week. The way that they choose to gain or earn those 50 XP is based upon them. They might do a legendary challenge. They might continue along their path. They might go back and review old material. They might read a story or listen to the audio lessons, for example. These are all examples of giving students choice in their learning input when you're assigning XP. For the output, you could allow students to show their learning in multiple different ways in the classroom. For example, your students recently listened to a Duolingo podcast together in class, and you would like your students to demonstrate to you what they have understood from that podcast. You could ask your students to choose to maybe either draw their understanding of the learning language, what exactly they understood from the podcast. Students might be able to choose to speak to you privately and share what they've learned from the podcast in the learning language. Perhaps students could choose to write a quick summary about what they have learned in the learning language, or perhaps students could also simply bulletproof what they understood in the learning language. So all of these are examples of student choice of output and how they demonstrate their understanding. I talked a little bit about relevance and how, Gabriel talked about relevance, and I also want to mention it. So providing students with engaging materials that are relevant to their lives and their interests really helps to drive student motivation. So this is one of the reasons actually for which that Duolingo has started to invest in characters with diverse backgrounds and interests, so students can start to see themselves in these characters and be inspired and be motivated. But other ways to increase student relevance in the classroom would be framing language learning around topics of interest to your students. I am going to, one moment, pause and take a look at the chat, and I see someone else is joining us, so I'm going to admit them. We do have a mistake. We could revisit some of these language learning mishaps later on, but I cannot wait to read about that. Thanks for sharing, Pamela. Let's talk a little bit more about how you could increase extrinsic motivation for your students. So I just talked a little bit about that intrinsic motivation. So how do we talk about through extrinsic motivation? So extrinsic motivation is reward-driven behavior. So the gamification itself of Duolingo is an example of this reward-driven behavior. right? Your students are playing for gems, XP, to win the classroom leaderboard, to complete a monthly badge to be displayed on their profile, etc. There's so many examples of this gamification that students are going to be extrinsically motivated by for these rewards. So these are the things that Duolingo really taps into to get students motivated and to keep them learning. So ways that you in the classroom could build upon that would be to create additional class competitions. We have students, or excuse me, we have teachers in our educators network who have showed us their class competitions. They have a class streak board where they're monitoring student streaks, for example. They have classroom leaderboards where they're in competition with other classrooms in their school who are also on their own leaderboards and learning a language. And they do a really great job by adding other adults, teachers and administrators from the building as well. So these are all additional ways to increase that gamification, increase that reward-driven behavior and that extrinsic motivation. Another way is by rewarding your students, of course, in classrooms. So you could be rewarding them with, stickers or candy, or just little things like that, or even just certificates, Duolingo certificates, for example, to reward them for their hard work. Or if you have a classroom economy, I've talked about this in a past session about gamification and how we have a resource called Duo Dollars. You could be giving your students some Duo Dollars to get them excited about learning. Now let's talk a little bit about self-confidence. So students who feel welcome and respected in the classroom are going to have higher self-confidence, of course. So a lot of this starts with your classroom culture, getting to know your students and fostering that feeling of belonging with them. But I do want to mention that specifically with Duolingo, we really help students to build their self-confidence by focusing on small little victories along their personalized learning path. The way that lessons are set up, every lesson that they complete, they are essentially getting 100 every time, because if they make a mistake, they have to keep at it, and we make it a little easier if they keep making that mistake as well, until they get it right and they're able to go on to the next unit, the next lesson, for example. So essentially, every time they end up getting 100. And then we have a small victory that is celebrated afterwards with animations, with streaks, for example, with our fun little characters like we're seeing here on the screen. So these little things get our students feeling good about themselves and seeing themselves make progress. So it really helps build up their self-confidence. Again, about recognizing, rewarding students for their streaks, rewarding students for being on that classroom leaderboard, for example, are great ways to bring this to your classroom and to start building up their self-confidence through that as well. And get other students involved and encourage them to cheer each other on and to congratulate their classmates to increase their self-confidence. Now I want to talk a little bit about anxiety. So a classroom that embraces errors as part of the learning process is a safe classroom. And feeling safe is a way to lower students' anxiety, which would, of course, then lower their affective filters to increase learning. So a little earlier on today, I asked you to share a language learning mishap that you have had, because we have all had them. It's part of learning a language, it's part of learning anything, it's part of being human, right? So making sure to foster that and embrace mistakes with your students is really important for them. So as teachers, a great way to form this energy in your classroom is by modeling this kind of accepted behavior yourself. Tell your students if you ever make mistakes. Share with them, right, these funny language learning mishaps that you've had in the past. Encourage them to laugh about their mistakes and know that it's simply a normal part of the learning experience that everyone goes through, yourself included. Therefore, it's nothing to be ashamed of. For example, I'm never going to forget the language mistake that my high school French teacher shared with us. He was actually in high school. He was, I believe, about 15 years old. He was young, studying abroad in France for the first time. was having a really hard time with the language barrier. He felt down. He felt like it was difficult for him to connect with other students, but he found a good way to connect, and that was through tennis, actually. So he set up the scene for us. There was a tennis tournament at the school. Everyone was there watching him. It was a really heated match. And at the end of the game, he actually triumphed, and he dramatically fell down on his knees and he proclaimed in French, "Je suis le champignon." So he said, "I am the mushroom" in French, as opposed to saying, "I am the champion." So he said champignon as opposed to champion. So he, we never made that mistake in class with that difference in pronunciation of those two words. So he screamed, "I am the mushroom," and he didn't understand why everyone started to laugh at him. So it was a great way for us students to know that he made mistakes himself when learning the language, and it's just a normal part of the process. So I especially love how when students make errors on Duolingo specifically, they have their ability to see those mistakes, try again. And if they continue to make that mistake, Duolingo is going to make it easier for them in order to get it right and to move on, for example. And then later on in future Duolingo sessions, these mistakes are going to filter back through until students are more comfortable with that material. So this is a really low stake way of making mistakes. The system corrects you automatically and allows you to do it again until you get it right. And students have the added benefit of this being private to them. There's none of that added anxiety of students making these mistakes in front of the classroom in a highly visible way. So there's none of that in front of the whole school screaming, "I am the mushroom," for example. So speaking in the language, learning language itself is really anxiety inducing for some of our students. They're afraid to make mistakes. They're afraid to be laughed at. They're afraid of sounding stupid. And I actually, my first year teaching, I didn't realize how strong this anxiety was for some students. I remember my first year teaching, I taught a few sections of Spanish. I was a long-term Spanish teacher for two 8th grade classes. And we were running into the typical end of the year speaking exam. Excuse me, it was end of the unit, was end of the year. It was end of the unit, like speaking exam, check-in with students, where we had a conversation with me one-on-one for a grade. And one student actually came up and she was shaking. I could tell she was so anxious, and she started to cry right before we even started because she was just so nervous to speak in the learning language. And I just felt so awful about it. I didn't realize the amount of anxiety that small moment had for some students. So again, we really must be fostering that positive classroom atmosphere where students' anxiety is lowered and their confidence and their motivation are high. And I do actually want to shout out, I know we're talking about Duolingo here and lowering the affective filter, but I want to shout out another ed tech company that I used to use in my classroom for this very reason. I used to use an application called Flip, formerly known as Flipgrid. Let me know if you've ever used it. Pamela, I believe that you have. So let me know a little bit about your experience with it. But I started using this and I was really amazed at how much it lowered my students' anxiety to speak in the target language. And if you aren't familiar with the product, essentially you and your students are able to create videos yourself and start a classroom grid where either all videos are public to the class, or you could even make them private just to you as the teacher. But I would pose a question in the target language for my students by video. I would post it on Flip on my classroom. And then I would ask for my students to respond in the target language. So I would do this as an in-classroom activity or even as a homework assignment. And I really loved it as well. You could either be given feedback by video, or you could give feedback by private message with your students. Students had the ability to have like a post-it note for themselves while they're speaking to help them with notes. So I loved using it for targeted language practice for that reason. And sometimes the videos would be private for me, and sometimes the whole class could see them. And I was actually shocked at how much students actually wanted other students to see their videos, despite the fact that they were speaking in a foreign language. And usually that was not something they wanted others to see. In this case, with this application, they wanted others to see it. They weren't anxious and nervous about their language use because they could be silly in these videos by adding filters to their videos or other funny images. So I'm convinced that students had so much fun and were just interested in being silly with their classmates that they almost forgot to be nervous about their language use. And maybe they even forgot that they were actually doing work. And it didn't bother me at all that they would play around with the engagement features in the app because my students were all completing the communicative task at hand. So again, as I said earlier, I was amazed as to how much this lowered my students' anxiety. And then they were able to produce the target language. So a little bit of a recap. Choice and relevance help with intrinsic motivation. Reward students for that extrinsic motivation and take advantage of the gamification to help with motivation too. Celebrate those little victories for student self-confidence. Lower anxiety by cultivating a classroom of risk-taking, and model these behaviors for your students and focus on that class culture. So I'm really curious, what are some of your tips for lowering the affective filter? How exactly have you yourself lowered the affective filter? Whether or not you knew that this is what you were doing, lowering the affective filter, if you knew about this kind of this theory in the past, these are still all things that teachers are mindful of, focusing on motivation, engagement for your students, focus on creating a positive class culture, risk-taking class culture, lowering their anxiety and embarrassment, for example. These are all things that whether or not you knew this was relevant to affective filter or not, these are all things that we have done and been conscious about as language teachers. So please let me know, what are some of your tips? Because of course, what I just mentioned is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much that we could and should be doing for our students in the classroom to help foster that positive environment for them. So please share with me some of your tips. So I look forward to, I'll take a look now in the chat, actually. Let's see. I love that. I give infinite retakes and redos, and we play a lot of games. Absolutely. I love that idea of retakes and redos, because it doesn't matter how many times it takes them, right? And in the end, it's not even about the grade, it's just about the actual output, right? Them utilizing the learning language, whether it takes, one try or 10 tries. It's about actually the journey and utilizing the language. So I really love that. And the fact that you play a lot of games, absolutely, 100%. I remember my students loved games. They loved anything to do with competition. So that was something that spoke very highly to my students as well. And I tell the students how I didn't get my driver's lessons on the first try. It's the same thing. Absolutely. Yeah, it's the same thing for anything. A lot of what we're talking about now, we're talking specifically for world language teachers, but of course this is relevant to so many things in our lives. And making mistakes, of course, happens in so many different subjects as well. For example, I love that. Thanks, Pamela. Oh yes, Pamela, you have used Flip. Yeah. They insisted on covering up the camera because of the affective filter. That really surprises me, because I wonder, I know that Flip has changed and I haven't played with it with these past 2 years or so. But my students, because of those images that they were able to like lay over their image, my students didn't feel uncomfortable with being on camera. So that shocks me a little bit. I wonder why that is. Maybe my students were just all into taking risks and wanted to be silly with all their classmates. But of course, all of our classes are different. All of our students are different. So the outcome might not always be the same, but the fact that they use it is great. So yes, have them use the voice recorder instead. And nowadays there are stickers that the students could put over their videos. Yeah, so maybe the stickers weren't there before. I wonder, because I had only used it my second to last year of teaching, and I don't believe I used it my last year of teaching. So I'm sure the product has changed a little bit, but I was really surprised as to how much my students loved using it. Maybe your students are braver than mine. It was pre-pandemic. It was pre-pandemic when I used it. It was 2000, my gosh, when was the pandemic? 2017, I believe, is when I used it. So yeah, maybe it's changed a little bit, but let me know some of your tips for how you lower the affective filter. And I want to just ask a little bit about feedback. So I'm really curious. We've been giving these sessions, these PD sessions, specifically for world language teachers. So I'm curious as to what kind of PD sessions that you would be interested in the future. What would you like to see? What would you like to learn about? What would you like to talk about specifically with Duolingo for Schools? So I'd be very interested to know what kind of PD sessions you'd like. And then next feedback I would love to get from you is what kind of Duolingo resources might be helpful? So what kind of things do you need to be successful in the classroom with your students? What you would like for your students and for your classroom? So feel free to give me any of that feedback now. You could join our educators network and let us know there, or you could always send us an email to educators@duolingo.com. So as I mentioned, join us on Facebook, join us on our educators network. I'm going to share the link in the chats here. Here we are. I'm going to share that link. And so join us in our educators network. Pamela here talked about a little bit about how she appreciates the educators network as a professional learning community. We're always there sharing ideas, tips. Pamela's always sharing amazing resources, the games that she has created. We really appreciate Pamela there. So please join us in the educators network. And if you don't have Facebook or you're not active on it, please join us on any of our other social media accounts, such as Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, even. I mean, TikTok's new too. And as I mentioned earlier, Pamela's classes and other teachers' classes have been featured on our TikTok account. And you could actually also be featured if you would like. So join us on social media and connect with us.